Okay, our next panelist will be Comrade Cheryl LaBash, who will speak on socialism and struggle, a view to Cuba and Latin America's fight for independence. Cheryl is a contributing editor of Workers' World newspaper and a national leader in defense of Cuba and to free the Cuban flag. Cheryl?
You need some water?
Yeah, thank you. Since 1962, the United States government has blockaded Cuba. This blockade is in place to punish the Cuban Revolution for daring to be independent from capitalism. The economic trade and travel ban is only one hammer in the imperialist toolbox, which has been modernized recently. As we've seen recently with the Zunzuneo phony Twitter application that was put out by the USAID and the recent expose that USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, employs youth from Latin America countries to pose as AIDS educators and search out Cuban youth who might be swayed to act against the socialist government. I mean, Cuba's had the most advanced treatment of AIDS in the world, and to think that they could, falsely put these AIDS educators out there to undermine the Cuban government. But what I'm saying is that they've modernized their effort at overturning, the U.S. imperialists have modernized their effort at overturning the Cuban Revolution. And it's not only aimed internally, it's also extraterritorial. The extraterritorial character of the blockade actually began in 1962. The Kennedy administration banned ships, regardless of their country of origin, that had any commercial relation with Cuba from docking in U.S. ports. In 1992, the Torricelli Act was signed, extending the ban on U.S. subsidiaries in third countries trading with Cuba. It banned any ship leaving Cuba from docking in the United States for 6 months. And it actively funded regime change programs. The interesting thing is that 1992 was after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's when the United States geared up to destroy the Cuban Revolution because they felt that it was weak. It's also when the attacks on Cuba, the violent bombings in the 1990s started up. Hotel bombings, restaurant bombings, trying to destroy Cuba's effort at beginning more of a commercial tourist trade to boost their economy and continue providing for the people. The Torricelli Act was followed by Helms-Burton. That was in 1996, and it was cynically called Libertad, which in Spanish is, liberty. This codifies, instead of the blockade being a presidential, that could be repealed by the president, because it was initially an emergency, supposed to show that it can be by emergency order, right? It actually became codified into law, and it directly applied the blockade to foreign countries. It's not just subsidiaries of U.S. corporations, but foreign companies, and it actually mandated an annually updated plan for regime change and what regime change would look like in Cuba. The cost of this blockade to revolutionary Cuba is very high, but it has not weakened Cuba's commitment to construct socialism. And by that I mean that the fullest development and needs of human beings are the priority for society, not capitalist profit. And of course, the Cuban Communist Party and the Cuban people are not developing this historic project in isolation. As we know, the world has changed significantly, certainly since 1959, but also since 1996. I'm certain that yesterday there was discussion of the decline of capitalism and how capitalism is at a dead end and what that means. French, Swiss, and other non-U.S. banks and corporations have coughed up steep fines for violating the blockade of Cuba. This is the kind of the higher level. One of the things that we found is in recent history, people from the United States who are still banned from traveling through Cuba, really, there are no scary letters anymore, there's no action taken. You might get harassed when you cross the border a little bit, but really nothing happens. And that's because they've elevated the blockade and made it on a technologically higher level where financial transactions are blocked or are seized, and you have to prove that this transaction is legal in order to get your money back. There's a really hilarious example of this where an organization in Britain ordered a book that's published by Monthly Review, and it's written by a French professor, Salim Lamrani. The only thing it had to do with Cuba is that the title was The Economic War Against Cuba, and the funds from Britain were intercepted and were not transferred to Monthly Review, so they could not order the book. So this is, it shows the kind of level that this is happening on. In addition, the Cuban intersection and the Cuban mission in the United States cannot get a bank account. M&T Bank used to be the bank that handled their bank accounts. You know, you need a bank account, and what M&T Bank said, well, we're not going to do this anymore. In fact, we're not going to do any international accounts anymore. So for more than a year now, of course the U.S. government says that they're helping because it is kind of an embarrassment that the Cubans can't get a bank account. And to this date, in fact, there was just an announcement that they still haven't been able to figure out some other way. And if somebody comes in to renew their passport or do some other consular business, there's a payment for that, and there's no way to process the payment. This is not only affecting Cuba. The other small countries that don't have their own banks are affected by this as well. And it's my understanding that other missions to the United Nations have been affected because the banks, there are so many regulations now on international transactions because of quote unquote money laundering and so-called anti-terrorism and that sort of thing, that it's just not financially lucrative enough for the banks to go through all the hassle of having these accounts. So I actually meant to pull out a dollar bill. U.S. imperialist domination is really embodied in the dollar as the global unit of foreign exchange. And like I said, it reaches much farther than Cuba. Take Argentina, for example, which we in Detroit can feel some affinity for. The ruling of a U.S. judge in New York City is forcing the sovereign, formerly colonized country to default on behalf of vulture capitalist hedge funds, because these hedge funds bought up a very small amount of the old Argentine debt for cents on the dollar. And now they want to press it so they can make a hefty profit and get paid in full for this debt that wasn't even theirs. They are speculators. representing the small fraction of the original debt that was successfully renegotiated with more than 90% of the old 2001 bondholders. Argentina has transferred the payments to the current trustee. They made a good faith effort to pay it. They paid it to New York Mellon Corporation. But New York Mellon says, we can't do anything. The judge said, we can't do it. We can't transfer the payments to the people it's supposed to go to. So now the government in Argentina is proposing that the bondholders that renegotiated should swap those bonds for a local bond that can be paid through a bank in Buenos Aires. And that would be out of the reach of the U.S. courts. Now, the judge's reaction to this was pretty amusing, too. Now, this judge wants the hedge funds paid first. He called the new plan that Argentina has, lawless. And he said, it's illegal, and the court directs that it cannot be carried out, he says, from New York. Well, how long is it going to be before there's an irresistible demand for international finance without the imperialist dollar? Right. Of course, this is a very serious matter, because it's worth noting that a proponent of trading oil in euros and then another advocating an independent continental development bank for Africa were both proposed by the U.S. military. And I'm talking about Iraq and Libya. Wow. Now, on the question of debt, and as long ago as 1985, then Cuban President Fidel Castro analyzed the Latin American foreign debt as unpayable, and that the hardships imposed on the people would in fact bring social explosions. In 1998, not even a decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Hugo Chavez, leader of the unsuccessful 1992 military coup d'etat, was elected president of Venezuela. Hugo Chavez proposed the Bolivarian Alliance for the People of Our America in 2001 as an alternative to the imperialist free trade agreements that were destroying the economies throughout Latin America. And ALBA together, Venezuela and Cuba together launched ALBA in 2004. From 1999 to 2005, struggle racked Bolivia over privatization of water and imperialist extraction of gas. Can we ever forget the marchers of the miners holding dynamite as they struggled against the imperialists? Evo Morales, the first and also the imperialist extraction of gas. Evo Morales, the first indigenous president, was elected in 2005. What has happened as a result of these changes, even though they appear to be electoral, they're coming out of the mass struggle, is that illiteracy was eradicated in Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua. The very first task is making sure that the people are literate, that the people can read, and that the people are not excluded. The most oppressed are not excluded from participation in society. One of the first things that Hugo Chavez did is all of the people who had no documents, who had no birth certificates, who had no identification, he gave everybody identification so they could fully participate in society. The principles of ALBA are that commerce and investment are not an end. Rather, they're a means to reach equitable and sustainable development. That economic cooperation and what they call complementarity within the member countries is what's important, not competition. Cooperation and solidarity is the foundation for special plans for the region's least developed countries. And we've seen that with Haiti, where special attention, extra money, extra resources, support for energy were devoted and are devoted to Haiti. Energy integration to ensure energy security for all. Regional capital for investment instead of reliance on investors beyond the region. Protection of the environment, local cultures, and identities. The Bank of Alba, and the Bank of the South, has been developed, and a virtual currency for international trade. So a portion of the finances of each country is put into this pool. An example of this is the work that Alba's done with Haiti. And also it's a political arm too. It's come out for the right of Puerto Rico to self-determination and independence as part of the region. So it's no wonder that the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and their elected president, Nicolas Maduro, are in the imperialist crosshairs. Dividing the process of continental unity and integration in Latin America is certainly in the imperialist game plan. And that unity and continental integration is happening on many levels, from UNASUR, Union of South American Nations, and CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, ESNA, the Encuentro Sindical Nuestra America, which is working class unification. They're working on all levels to provide an anti-imperialist front. Even though these countries in Latin America and Central America have different political systems. I mean, Cuba is the only socialist country there, and then there are others that are moving towards socialism or struggling for socialism. Others, like Brazil, that sometimes is progressive and sometimes, but it's a major economic force. But they're able to work together politically against imperialism because it goes back to the anti-colonial struggle and the independence and self-determination struggle that really unites all of the people of Latin America and the Caribbean. There are the Colombian peace talks in progress in Havana that are yet another step forward to ending that, the guerrilla war that was defensive, because any effort at elections in 1948, the progressive candidate for president was assassinated, which is what touched off the need for armed struggle there. And so there's a real possibility that it will be put to rest and the people of Colombia will be able to advance like the rest of Latin America. And until the 2009 coup in Honduras was part of ALBA as well. And now the latest news is that the pristine beaches along the Caribbean in the Afro-Indigenous Garifuna region of Honduras are targeted for hotel development and and you know how that is here in Detroit too, and displacement of the residents. And that means that there's going to be more struggle. So the price of imperialism is evident in the children fleeing the homeland, like Honduras, with no future and migrating to the cruel U.S. border. We should be clear that the Bolivarian Revolution has not defeated the domestic capitalist elements, many of whom are linked with the U.S. as the 2002 short-lived coup in Venezuela showed. But the struggle is advancing. A recent video tells the story of homeless families. One of the biggest challenges in Venezuela is housing. So hundreds of homeless families took over an abandoned, half-constructed apartment building to have an alternative to the hillside shanties that get washed away in the rain. And this was pending the construction of new housing so they could be relocated. But they went right into Caracas and took this over and built a community there. They took on solving the problem and struggling to do that. In 2012, the new Venezuelan labor law is certainly an example of the constant pressure of revolutionary forces, not only to involve and uplift the most oppressed, but to find ways of challenging and overcoming the capitalist elements still in Venezuela. And I made like a few copies of it, and I'm not going to go into the whole thing. But one of the most significant things about it is if employers wish to dismiss an employee, they must now approach the court in order to determine whether or not there is a legal basis for that dismissal. So no, what it does is it takes away the right of the bosses and gives it to the workers. So, plus tremendous other protection for LGBT workers, maternity leave with full pay, and a whole host of advances. So, in trying to imagine what socialism would look like here, think about the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, or the bus service, or abandoned houses. Are there any of these problems without a solution? Couldn't the bus drivers, the mechanics, the riders, and people with disabilities figure out how to make transportation work? I know they can. What stands in the way is a capitalist economic system and government structures that are geared to siphoning off the wealth the working class produces into the pockets of the super rich capitalist class. And that is exactly why we need a Leninist party to centralize, organize, and intervene in the coming struggles and explosions that will surely come as they came in Latin America. We can see the future on its way in the solidarity between the Palestinians in Gaza and the black youth in Missouri. Oh.